Hi everyone, welcome to week 6 of my tutor squads. So this week we're going to be continuing with the Numeracy Game problem that I introduced at the end of last lesson. So hopefully you've had a chance to work through that yourselves, and we're going to have a look at a potential solution for that. And you can of course ask any questions you have about that. Potentially as well, depending on how quickly we get through that, we might have a look at some GCSE pseudocode exam questions because someone asked about that last week. We'll just see how far we get with that. As always, feel free to ask questions throughout the session. If they're directly related to what we're doing, then I'll try and answer them as quickly as possible. I'm checking the chat every 2 minutes or so. If they're more general questions, which I'd be very happy to answer, I'll probably wait until the Q&A session in the last 15 minutes. So yeah, right. Let's get into that. Okay. Just going to share my screen. Yeah. Okay, I think that's working now. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So at the end of last lesson, I introduced this problem, and I'll just recap over what the problem entails. So essentially, we're going to ask 10 basic numeracy questions, and each question consists of 2 random numbers between 1 and 10, and either a plus, times, or subtract sign. We're not going to include divide by because that can get very messy. And this is also going to be randomized as well. So the first question might say 5 plus 5, the second question might be 6 times 7, third might be 10 minus 5 or something. So the numbers are randomly generated and the sign is also randomly generated. The user should be able to input their answer, and then we check if it's correct. If it's correct, print correct, otherwise print incorrect. And we also add 1 to their score as well. So then at the end of the game, we're going to print their score out of 10 so they know how many they've got correctly as well. Okay. So I also gave you a bit of a start on sort of planning this. So the first part is creating the question, and we need to break this down a little bit further into what's entails. Okay, so we know that there are a few different parts to the question. We have the 2 random numbers and the sign. So we're going to need to choose 2 random numbers and choose a sign. Okay. So let's probably change this to Python. Okay, I think I'll create a new lesson for this actually. Okay. So just bear with me one moment. I will also share this at the end of the lesson as well, so you can have a look at the code. So yeah, in the previous lessons as well, in the description section, you can find last week's code and the previous week as well. And I'll do the same at the end of this lesson, so you'll be able to view it. So yeah. Okay. Right, so let's just comment all this stuff out. So create a bit of space here at the start of our code. So we're going to create the question, choose 2 random numbers and choose the sign. So let's first work on choosing the 2 random numbers. So we know that we need to import the random package because that contains all the random functions and everything. And then to create a random number, if you recall, the syntax looked like this. You have random.randint, and then your lower and your upper bound. So in this case, we're creating random numbers between 1 and 10. And we want to store them in two variables. We'll call it the first one num1 and the second one num2. Okay. Right, got two random numbers. That was fairly straightforward. Now the sign is a little bit more complicated. So we can't just do random.randint and then choose a particular sign. There's no function for that. Random does not have a function for choosing a particular string from a list. Now there is something we could use here. I think there's something like random.choose. Might have to check for that. But what I'd recommend here is generate another random integer. So we have three options. We have plus, subtract, and multiply. So therefore, generate a random number between 0 and 2. So therefore you have three options. And depending on what number you get, you either choose plus, minus, or multiply. Okay. So let's call this up, and we'll do it in the same way as we've generated the random numbers, but this time between 0 and 2. Okay. And now we need some if statements. So if op is 0, for instance, we might choose a plus. So what's that if statement look like? We have if, and then we have if op double equals, because we're comparing values, equals 0. Then we choose plus. So let's have a variable for this as well. Let's have op symbol, for instance. Just leave it as a blank string initially, and we'll then make that equal to plus. Okay. Get rid of this. We could say when op equals 1, then we're going to make the op symbol minus, and if op equals 2, we're going to choose multiply. Okay. Right, so those are our three options. And if we want to print it all together, let's have a look at how we can combine each part. So if you recall, we can't print integers with strings directly. We have to first convert the integers to strings before we can print them all together. And we do that using the str function. So we'll put num1 into the str function, and that will create a string. We're then going to concatenate it with the op symbol, which is already a string, so we're fine there, and also with the string of num2. So we use these pluses to join it all together and convert it into one string that we're then going to print. Okay. Right, so if we run this now, hopefully this works. 5 times 6, 2 plus 3, 6 plus 10, 1 minus 2, etc. Yeah. Okay, so that's that first part done. We've created the question now. The next part is getting the answer. Right, so we need to write some code that works out the answer. And this is going to depend on what the op symbol is. Okay. So we could write some separate if statements that say if the op symbol is this, 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 then the answer is this. However, we've already got those if statements written. So we may as well save ourselves writing it multiple times and define the answer in here. So let's just define it outside of the if statements first. The reason being, I mentioned this, I think, last lesson. If you only define the variables inside the if statements, the interpreter won't know that it will always be defined, because it can't work out that one of these statements will always be true. That's a bit too complicated for it, because it would have to evaluate everything first, and it just doesn't work. So therefore you have to give it a value to start with, so that it knows it's guaranteed to have a value once you get outside of the if statements here. So essentially, if none of the if statements were to be true, which in this case is impossible, but the interpreter doesn't know that, then answer would definitely have a value because you've defined it up here. So that's why it needs to have a value here. Same with op symbol as well. Okay, so we define answer as 0, could be any value really, it's going to be changed. So when the op symbol is plus, we're going to do answer equals num1 plus num2. When the op symbol is subtract, we're going to do answer equals num1 minus num2. And when the op symbol is multiply, we're going to do answer equals num1 times by num2. Okay. Right, so we've now worked out what the actual answer is. We now need to get the user's input, which is on line 7 there, and we check if it matches the answer, if it's correct. Okay. Right. So we printed the question. Let's now get an input. So let's change this print to an input function instead. And let's call this like user answer. Yeah. Okay, so what this is going to do now is it's going to print the question as a prompt for an input. So let's also just add in a question mark or something so the user knows they need to respond. And a nice trick as well is to use \n so that the user's answer, when they write it, will be below the question. So it's a little bit nicer that way. Okay, now there's one thing we're missing here. So the user's answer will be an integer. And we need to specify that we're inputting an integer and not a string. If we don't do this, then when we check if the answer is correct, we're going to be trying to compare two integers, but actually what the program will be doing is comparing the string that we've inputted to an integer, and it wouldn't work. So therefore we have to say that we're inputting an integer here. So we can then do if user answer equals answer, then it's correct, and we can print that out to the user. And then else, it's incorrect. Okay. So we also were told that we need to print the score as well at the end. So we need to keep track of how many questions the user gets correct. So to do this, the score is going to start at 0. So let's define that up here. Score equals 0. And every time the user gets a question correct, we're going to add 1 to the score. And if the user doesn't get it correct, the score just stays as it is. Okay. Right, so there's just one more thing we need to do here now. So before we get onto that, let's just check this all works correctly. So as said, we've used \n here, so that means that it's left a line after the question. So let's input 13, it says correct. Let's get this wrong, it says 20, it's incorrect. Perfect. So the one thing we haven't done here is make sure it asks 10 questions. This is probably the most tricky part, really, because so far everything we've done is basically write comments and then convert that into a single line of code. This isn't quite so simple because we're going to need to adjust a few things. So I asked down here, what programming construct are we going to use to ask 10 questions? And we need to use a loop. So this could be a while loop or it could be a for loop. And if you remember, a while loop can be used with any condition. However, a for loop can only be used when the number of iterations is known. So for instance, if you were watching last week, we did a guess the number game. And in that, we didn't know the number of iterations because it depended on the user getting the number correct. It would just continue until they guessed correctly. So for that, we couldn't use a for loop. So we had to use a while loop. In this case, however, we know the number of iterations. We know we're asking 10 questions. So therefore, we just do a for loop and have it run 10 times. Okay, now we need to think what is going to be in this loop. So if we go through this, we're obviously not going to include the import statement because that would just be at the start. We're not going to include the score equals 0 either because we want to set that at the start and we don't want to keep resetting it with every iteration. But all of this stuff from lines 24 down all the way to 49, we want that to be in the loop because we want to ask a different question every time and repeat this process 10 times. So if we write this for loop, let's use I in range, it'll just be for in range 10. Ask 10 questions. Then we're going to indent this so it's inside the for loop. And there we go. This should now ask 10 questions. And the one last thing we need to do is print the score at the end. So let's write a nice print statement, not just print score, because the user will need some context. If you just print 5, they may not know what you're talking about. So say something like, you got score out of 10. So this print like you got 8 out of 10 or something. So you know exactly what it means. Okay. Right, so let's try this. Get a few incorrect, a few correct. Okay, yeah. And you can see it's counted correctly. There's 2 that were wrong, everything else was correct. And it says you got 8 out of 10. So everything works perfectly. Okay. I think the last thing we need to do now is add a few comments to this so that we know exactly what we're doing in each part of the code. So put a comment here to say why we're doing for I'm range 10. So it's basically saying we're asking 10 questions. Here we're generating 2 random numbers, 1 to 10. And then here we are choosing either plus, minus, or multiply. And then below here we calculate the answer. Here we get the user's answer, check if it's correct, and then, yeah, that's pretty much all we need to say, really. So just a general comment about what is happening in a certain section. You don't need to have comments on every line because it can get a bit difficult to read. But just a simple comment here, like saying, this is what's happening in this section. This is what's happening on this line. This is what's happening in this if statement. And if, for instance, on line 53, I haven't written a comment because that's fairly self-explanatory. You got a score out of 10, speaks for itself. You don't really need to say it's printing the score because that's fairly self-explanatory. Okay. Yeah. And that is pretty much it really for the Numeracy game. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But if not, we've got a bit of time now. So we'll look at some GCSE pseudocode questions. Someone asked about that last week. So this is the June 2021 paper, or actually November 2021 paper. And if you're wanting to find them online, there's various sites. I usually just use Revision World. You can get them on OCR's website as well, but this is just a little bit easier to navigate. So as you can see, this is the paper 2. So there's a variety of different questions in this. Not all of them are coding. Lots of different question formats. So let's just go through a few of the coding ones then. So this is a very typical GCSE question, 3-part A. So Taylor is writing an algorithm to record the results of an experiment. Taylor needs to be able to enter a numeric value which is added to a total which initially starts at 0. Every time she enters a value, the total is output, and the algorithm repeats until the total is over 100. We need to write an algorithm to implement Taylor's requirements. Okay. Right, let's just create a new Python file. Yeah. Okay, we'll just create a new file for now. Okay. Okay, so this is worth 6 marks. Let's break this down into what it's asking. So we have a total which initially starts at 0. So straight away we know, let's define some variables. We'll define total as 0. So she should be able to enter a numeric value which is added to a total. So we're going to need to take an input. Let's just keep that as that for now. It's an integer, so we need this. Now, bear in mind with most GCSE boards, so this is OCR, you can write your code in pseudocode. And basically, if you don't know, pseudocode is kind of like writing code in English. It's very similar to Python, but it's even more simplified. So if you don't really know how to write in pseudocode, don't worry. If you were to take this exam, Python is very similar. So generally, I would advise you can write in Python. And for these questions, obviously, we've been doing Python so far. We'll just write it as though it was a Python question. So therefore, you need to specify that it's an integer you're inputting, and you're adding this to the total. So we're going to do total plus equals means add to total this value. Okay. Right, so every time she enters a value, the total should be output. So we need to print that. So we'll print the total is total. I will just, we'll just create a Python file. I just have to duplicate this. So this will allow us to run it now. Okay. Yeah, and the algorithm is going to repeat until the total is over 100. So we see this repeat word. That tells us we're going to need a loop here. So it repeats until the total is over 100. So therefore the number of iterations isn't known. So we need to use a while loop. So this continues until the total is over 100. So in other words, it repeats while the total is less than or equal to 100. So that's what we're going to put here, the condition on which it keeps going. We'll move the total equals 0 outside the while loop as well, because we want that to be set initially, but not set every time, because otherwise it will keep being reset and we might never reach 100. Okay, and yeah, that should work fine now. So if we run, have to run main.copy, so let's rename this. I might just have to run it manually. Yeah, it does not like brackets. Yeah, this one replit is a little bit fiddly because the run button will only work for main.py. So I will just rename this to something else for now. Right, yeah. So let's call this Numeracy Game. We'll change this to be just main.py, so it will run. We'll change it later on as well. Okay. Right, let's run this now. Enter a value. Let's enter 50. Let's enter 30, 20, 1. Yeah, it works fine. Okay, and that is 6 marks. So very nice. So let's just look at the mark scheme as well. We'll see where the marks come from. So it's question 3A. So we can see here it's got an example, very similar to what we had there, just written in pseudocode. So we get a mark for initializing the total as 0. We can see we've done that there. Inputs number and stores the value. Yeah, we've inputted the value, we've added it to the total. That gets us 2 marks because that's the next bullet point. We print the total, 4th mark. We iterate, so basically don't worry about what BP24 means, but just basically continue while the total is less than or equal to 100. And then you get a mark for that condition, and we can see we've got that there, so therefore we've satisfied all 6 bullet points, and we get 6 marks. Okay. I think as we've got about 10-15 minutes left, let's just keep going through some more of these questions. If you do have any questions about anything we're going through or any general questions, feel free to get them in the chat, but I'll just keep going through this for now. Okay, let's try this one now. So this is worth 5 marks. We'll just comment this out for now. This will be available at the end of the lesson, so you can have a look through it and try it out yourself as well. Okay, so this is writing a pseudocode algorithm that uses iteration to allow Taylor to enter 10 values, count how many values are over 50, and then output the count of values over 50 after all 10 values are entered. Okay, so firstly it says we need to enter 10 values. How are we going to enter 10 values? Well, we need a for loop. And the number of iterations is known, so therefore we can use a for loop. We could also use a while loop, but it's a bit simpler using a for loop when we can. So similar to with the Numeracy game, we've got 10 iterations, we just do for I in range 10. Okay. And we're going to need to input these values. So let's do int input, enter a value. Yeah, let's put backslash n as well to make it a bit nicer. We'll store that in value. Okay. We're going to count how many of these values are over 50. How do we know if the value is over 50? We need to use an if statement. If value is greater than 50, then we need to add 1 to a count. Going to initialize this count. Let's call it like over 50. Initially, we only have we don't have any values that are over 50. Once we find one, we'll add 1 to over 50. Over 50 plus equals 1. And then at the end, we need to output the counter values over 50. This is after all 10 values entered. So we're going to do this outside the for loop. We'll print there are over 50 values over 50. There we go. Let's test this out now. So let's do 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So 5 values over 50. Let's do some under 50 now. 10, 20, 30, 40. And 50 is not over 50, so this shouldn't be counted. 5 values over 50 works correctly. Okay. And if we just look at the mark scheme for this, so this was question 3C part 2. You can see the code here, very similar to what we had. Initialize count variable to 0. We've done that. Ask the user for an input here. We've done that. Checks if it's over 50 and increments this count if it's true. We do that. And then finally, well, two more bullet points. So the 6 bullet points here, we only need 5. We satisfied all 6, but if you miss one of these, you can still get 5 marks. So we need to repeat this until 10 values are entered, and then we need to output the count once the 10 values have been entered. And we do that. So that'll be 5 marks. Okay. Right, let's try a few more of these. So we've got some shorter ones here. Let's try the longer ones first, I think. Okay, this is probably the trickiest question. This is 6 marks. So let's just look at the start of this first. So I'm just zooming in a bit as well to make it easier to read. OCR blocks is a game played on a 5x5 grid. Players take it in turns to place blocks on the board. It's a 2D array. So we probably haven't looked at 2D arrays yet in these sessions. So we'll just quickly go through this now. So this 2D array has the identifier game grid. This is just the identifier is like the name of the list. And we can see how it looks initially. And then we have this check block function, which checks whether a square on the board has been filled. And it gives you an example when check block 2 is called. The value A would be returned because A is in that position on the grid, as we can see here. Yeah. So basically, if it's A or B, it gives you whatever's on the grid. If it's blank, then it will return free to show that it's a free space. Okay, there's a few other questions here. So if we just quickly go through some of these as examples. So check block 2, 1. If we look at what's this going to return, so we can just look here, and we say that yeah, we go 2 rows down because it's row and then column. So 2 rows down, 1 along. Check block 2, 1 should return B. So then check block 3, 0 is 3 rows down, 0, that should return A. Check block 2, 3 is 2 rows down, 3 across, and that's blank, so therefore it would return 3. Okay. This is a very common question, part B. State one feature that shows it's a function, not a procedure. It returns a value. Procedures will never return a value, but functions do. And then part C is about some error. So we can see that it's trying to access row -1, which doesn't exist, which is why it produces an error. And then when it talks about describing how validation could be added to the check block function, you could have something that basically says the row and column entered are between 0 and 4. If they're less than 0, they're not valid. If they're greater than 4, they're not valid, and it should print something that basically says enter them again. Okay, so on to the question then. So we're writing an algorithm to allow player A to select a position for their next block on the game board. The algorithm must ask the player for the position of their block on the board, use the check block function to check if this position is free. If the position is free, add the letter A to the position chosen in the game grid array. If the position is not free, repeat the above steps until a free position is chosen. Okay. Let's copy this into code editor. Comment this out for now. Right, let's work through these bullet points. So generally with these questions, you're fine to just go through each bullet point and just think about how you're going to write this in code. Certainly at GCSE, most of the questions are like that. Once you get to A level, it does get a bit beyond that, and you might struggle to just convert bullet points to code directly, but it's still very useful for planning. You would just probably have to go into a bit more detail than the bullet points give in terms of your plan. Okay, so let's just look at this first bullet point. Asking the player for the position of their block on the board. So therefore we need two things. We need the row, we need the column. So let's get that. Row equals, it's an integer, into the row, leave a line, into the column. Very straightforward. Okay, done that. Use the check block function to check if this position is free, or use that. So let's just check this. Yeah. So it's check lowercase, so not uppercase b, and we pass in the row first and then the column. So we'll call it like this. So we need to check if this position is free. So if what it returns is the string free, yeah, it returns it as an integer, as a string with all capitals, so it should be like that. If it's free, then what do? We add the letter A to the position chosen in the game grid array because the player is moving to that position. Okay. How do we do that? We need to look at our game grid array. So we need to go game grid and then the row, the column, and set that to A. So we do this like that. There's a lot of red underlinings here, basically because the check block function hasn't been defined. So let's just copy that in, and we'll need to amend this slightly to work in Python. Now, of course, you won't if you're doing this exam, you won't need to worry about this. You're never going to be running code if you do OCR. I think some exam boards, certainly like international exam boards, they'll have exams where you actually write code and run it. I think Edexcel have just do Python questions in their paper 1 or paper 2, and you would actually have a computer for those. So it just depends on your exam board. But I think most in the UK don't have you actually writing and running code, so you don't need to worry too much about this. Yeah, if you were to sort of want to make this work in your own time when you're doing these questions, then this is what you'd have to do. So I'm just going to amend this to Python. It's very similar to pseudocode, as you can see. We just don't have these sort of end ifs and end functions and everything. We also need to define the game grid, which is kind of annoying. It's not defined there. I will very quickly define this. Gives you an example of how to define a 2D array. So we have in each row we have A and then blank, blank, B, blank, just copy and paste this a few times to save some time. So I'm just filling in the grid as you can see it in the question. So this is all blank, so get rid of that. This third row has B in the second position, so put that there and everything else is blank. This fourth row has A there, B there, so amend that, and then finally we have A just in the third position, nothing else there. Okay. So that's the game grid defined. So yeah, this should now work. That thing should be defined. Okay, so going back to the problem, we've checked if it's free. If the position is free, we add A to that position. If it's not free, so we have this else part here, then we repeat the above steps until a free position is chosen. It says repeat, so we need to use a loop. And the number of iterations is not known because it keeps going until we choose a free position, so we need to use a while loop. So we're basically going to do while this isn't free. While you keep choosing a grid space that isn't free, we're going to keep going. Only once you choose something that is free, do we finish? Okay. So let's also just make sure this works. So we'll have to get these as inputs first so that row and column are defined. Actually, I'll write it in a bit of a nicer way because this is getting a little bit messy. Let's use a Boolean flag. We'll just use continue set to true, while continue equals true, and then once okay. So what I've just done there very quickly, because we're running out of time, I've defined a Boolean flag called continue. I can't use the word continue, can I? Just put an S on it at the end, because continue is a keyword, so you can't use that for a variable. So we define continues to true. While continues is true, we keep asking for a row and column, and we check if it's free. Only once we find a free space do we set continues to be false. Otherwise, we print game grid space not free, and we keep going. This may look a bit complicated if you haven't really used Boolean flags very much. But all we're doing here is we're setting it to true initially to say we're starting, we keep going, and we're saying while we want to keep going, do this, and then it allows us to say when we want to stop. So when we want to stop, we set continues to false, and it will stop. And if we don't, it will keep going forever until we say stop. Okay, and this should now work for everything. So let's get an example. So we're gonna do, let's just input a few random ones. Input 2, column is 1, it's not free. Yeah, I haven't changed that. That's something that I haven't changed, but that should now be in Python. Change that as well. Yep, okay, that should all be fine. So let's do row 1, which is 0. We'll do column 0. That is not free because A is there. Let's do 2 and 1. B should be there, so it's not free. Let's do 1 and 1. That should be free. It stops because we've selected something correctly. And it will have set it to A. Okay. And if we look at the mark scheme, final question, let's see where the marks come from. We input the 2 position values separately. We have done that. We call the check block function. We've done that. With our inputs, we return the value. We do that. If free, we store A. We've done that. So you can see here. And then we have this loop. So yeah, basically they've done it in the same way using a Boolean flag. While a loop is true, they continues. So yeah, that'll be 6 marks. Okay. Yeah, I think next week then, so we've got 2 weeks left. We will probably look at a few more pseudocode questions if people want to. And also what I'd like to get onto is introducing leak code as well, because there are a lot of really good problems on LeetCode. There's some very challenging ones on there, so it is quite a challenging coding site, but there's still good problems for beginners as well. So I'd recommend people check it out. And I think I'll go through some problems on there as examples, take you through how to use the site, what to look for, and everything. And then really once you get going with the problems, you sort of build up your knowledge of different things. It's really good for like learning about different data structures and different types of programming problems and different approaches to problems you can take. Um, so I really recommend it. And there's so many problems on there. There's like a couple 2,000 or something. Actually, probably a lot more. 10,000 odd or something. It's a lot. So you can have a look at them as well next week. Okay. Anyway, thanks for joining the session. Yeah, I think there's a few questions that I've missed. They've only just come up now. Yeah, the computer science paper, I'll put it in the chat, but this is November 2021. Yeah, I apologize, Mohammed, but the questions, for some reason, have only just appeared now to me. So I apologize for not answering them during the lesson. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I think they all apply to this last one. So yeah, a few things I've already addressed. And yeah, in terms of the function, I'm not sure if you may have missed the start of when I was introducing this. But basically it allows players to place blocks on a grid. So you've got two players, A and B. They can place blocks wherever there's free spaces. Yeah. In terms of shortening the code, I don't think I really can here. Now, the only code you'd have to do for the actual question is this. I've just put this code in here to make it work. You would not have to worry about that. That's just to make it work when I'm showing you how it runs. So don't worry about that. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's all for today. I use string RC. Yeah, I think I've changed that now. So I've just used basically I've used two square brackets here. So the row is sort of the first dimension. The column is the second dimension. So essentially, this 2D array, it's an array of arrays. So if you do game grid R, that will refer to, say if R is 0, it will refer to this. If R is 1, it will refer to this. If R is 2, it will refer to this. And then C is the column, so that's the actual position in the array index. So if it's 0, 0, for instance, it'll be this. If it's 0, 3, it'll be this. If it's 0, 2, it'll be this. Yeah. So yeah, you need to use this to access elements in a 2D array to say which row it's in, which column it's in. So that's why you need two square brackets. If you have any other questions, just get them in quickly. I'm happy to answer any more questions you have. Well, we are overrunning a little bit here, so don't have too much longer. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what your question is. It's, the game is the question we've just been through. You're only bothered about whether the block is free or not. You're not really bothered about whether there's an A or B there, which one it is. You're just bothered about whether the block is free, whether you can put the A there. Um, so you don't need to output the actual letter. I mean, yeah, we've got that there. So if they enter a grid space that isn't free, it says game grid space not free, so they know if it's free or not. And if they choose a correct space, then the game just ends. Okay, hope that's cleared everything up. Yeah, no worries. If you want to, we can do a few more questions like this next week. Hopefully, the chat will also be a little bit better because unfortunately, I think it's lagging quite a lot. So loads of messages just come through at once, which is kind of annoying. Hopefully, it'll be better next week. Right. Anyway, thanks for joining the session, and I will see you all next week.